Video, we are going to look at using an object in a graphics project and actually doing collision detection for that object. So currently I have an object that has an X, Y, and size. It's going to represent an ellipse. In my main class, I've created a bunch of these objects randomly to appear on the screen using my randint method. I create a bunch in setup, so as soon as I run my program, I will see all of them. This may be a slightly different function than what you are doing for your game. And then I have one player that is a rectangle. So if I run this right now, I've got a player that moves around on the screen as I press the arrow keys, and I've got stagnant objects currently. Now, I really would love to be able to know when this red rectangle is intersecting or colliding with any of these ellipses. And at this moment, that isn't happening. Now, I can absolutely 100% write the logic to do those kinds of collision detections. I already know how to do that from graphics. So I could go through and for each ellipse or each object, I could figure out, okay, what's that object's position, double check what's going on. But that would add lots and lots and lots of code into my draw method. And we know that objects can totally shorten things that are going on. So what we really want to do is we want our object to have a way of knowing, like, is it being collided with? So we want each object to have the function and the ability to check collision. So for now, we're going to make a method called public void check collision. That's really just, its job is to let me know, like, hey, you object, are you being collided with by something else? So this collision check will do just like every other collision check. For our, circle and rectangle, this may be a little bit different if this was circle and circle versus rectangle and rectangle. So I'm going to leave this open-ended about like if X positions overlap, and then as a separate statement, if Y positions overlap, because that looks different if you're talking about rectangles and rectangles and rectangles, or circles and circles. So I'm leaving that generic for now on purpose. So if we have those two situations, then we would want to basically like say, yes, I am being collided with. And if we don't have those situations, we've made it out of those. Oops, let's do it like this. We've made it out of these if statements, then we would want to say no. Now, when I'm saying say no, say yes, that's information that like I want to know, someone else wants to know, that eventually we'll probably want to return. So instead of saying yes or saying no, we would probably want this method, instead of being void, to return a Boolean, where we would literally return yes, return true or return false. So it's going to be mad at me right now because all I have that's actually functioning in this method is returning true or returning false. It doesn't actually do anything right now. It's never going to get to this part. So it's like, what? You want me to return true and then also return false? So we have to think through this a little bit more of what these conditionals are, because these are still just comments for us. So what are those conditionals that I want to check for? Well, I want to know, like, for this object itself, is its, right edge touching the right edge of something else? So what I mean when I say is X position overlapping, what I really mean is let's say, for example, is the right edge of this ball object, or this object in this case, becomes greater than like the other player's other left edge, and at the same time is the left edge less than the other player's right edge. Like, are we sandwiched between in that way? That's what I'm checking for. Well, in order to know this, the right edge for us, the right edge of a circle would then be thinking about the X position plus half the size for a circle. That's how we get an edge. And the left edge would be that X position minus the radius, or half the size. Okay, great. So those are variables that I now know and have because I have X, Y, and oops, sorry, it's not S. The variable here is called size. So I'm going to begin to uncomment this out so we can see which part of this now your computer actually does understand and which part of this the computer is still confused about. In this moment, other left edge, like the other player, its left edge isn't yet something that we know. In fact, I'm going to change that in a second, so let's not worry about it. Other left edge. We don't have any other variables. We've got X, we've got Y, we've got size, and those are all talking about our object. So if we want to know information about something else, that is going to be information that will have to get passed into us. So for example, in this game, it's likely the case that we would want to know is the player intersecting with this object. So we need to know where that player is. So we are going to need inputs that tell me where the player's X, Y, and in this case, because it's a rectangle, we're going to need the player's width and the player's height. Now, these might be variables that you're like, well, yeah, but these aren't going to change. The width and height are stagnant. However, later in your game, you may want to have multiple players. You may want to change those sides. So let's go ahead and leave them as variables. Let's not try to remember what the player's width and height are. So if that's the case, if we're thinking about the other player's left edge, so the player's left edge, okay, on a rectangle, the left edge for the player is just going to be at play X, which is something that I'm passing in and then going to use. And for the other player's right edge, well, that's the X position of the player plus the player's width. That'll give me the right edge in this case. Now, I'm not doing the full logic of the full collision detection, but as you can see here, I'm using variables that are in purple. Those purple variables represent variables of this class. And I'm using variables that are actually showing up in black, and those are what we are considering those input variables. So in order to make this happen, let's undo one of those curly braces. Right now, this is not the full logic that we want to have happen, so it's not actually going to fully work in our game. But now I can actually call this check collision method on each of my objects. So as I am going through the process of looping over each object, I am drawing them, well, filling with a color and then drawing each one. Before we probably said something like cur.act. Now in this game for me right now, those little blue ellipses aren't trying to move. They're not trying to do anything. There's no action for them. What we really want to be able to do is like check if they're colliding or not. So we want to be able to call, cur.check collision. Now this check collision method needs 4 inputs. It needs the player's X position, it needs the player's Y position, it needs the player's width, and the player's height. So those 4 variables are being passed over as play X, play Y, play W, play height, so that I can use them in here. Then I'm going to either return true or return false as a Boolean, and that information will get passed back over here. Oh, it's not going anywhere yet, so we got to keep track of that information. We're going to have to keep track of, are they colliding? So I'm going to create a method called I'm going to create a variable called isColliding that we will hold that to. So let's go create that Boolean variable. So now we're going to loop over, and for each object, we're going to figure out, are we colliding, yes or no? And now we're holding that information. So then there's likely something that you'll want to have happen. So like if you are colliding, then maybe you want to reset something, or you want to change the color or something about that. So maybe let's say for now, let's make cur X equal, I don't know, -100, and cur Y will also equal -100. So now anytime we get a collision happening, the position of that object will move off screen. There's probably more that you could have happen as far as like, oh, if you're colliding, gain a life or lose a life for the player, or other things that are going on here, which is why we want this to be a method that we can then access inside of the main class, and why we want it to actually return information. In theory, if all you wanted it to do was to reset the position of the object, you don't need it to return anything, and you could just do that resetting here. However, most of the time that collision also has an effect on the player, which only exists in our main class. Therefore, we want to do all of the actions about colliding or not in the main class. in that way. So right now when I run this, it's going to do absolute nonsense because I haven't yet actually done full collision detection. I've just done weird partial collision detection. But let's see if at least we now see some actions occurring. So now as I move around, oh my goodness, look at that. It got rid of all of them because I'm not doing anything with the y variables yet. But look at how those objects are now acting or moving or changing as a result. So there you go. Obviously, you will need better collision detection going on here. Think about what are your shapes, what are the objects that you want to consider. Are they circles, are they rectangles? To think about how you want to do that collision detection. But this would allow you to do a collision detection check for your object.